Hello art friends, welcome back to my channel. As promised, I'm back with the part 2 of this watercolor landscape series. Last time we talked about value, composition, and edges, and today we're going to explore some colors. As you can see, I love to have a wide range of colors and values for my landscapes. I use colors from very muted grays to almost Studio Ghibli level of vibrancy. But in general, I would say my landscape colors are quite varied but also realistic, maybe just a little bit exaggerated. I'm gonna share a few tips for how to make your colors look cohesive and harmonious. Some of you might know that I use a very large palette. I got 35 colors from different brands. But to make things easier for beginners, I put together a small palette with colors that most beginners already have. We're going to be painting with both of them, and I'll show you how to mix colors with a small palette and also their limitations. For paper, I'm going to start with hot press paper, and when we get to the painting part, I will be switching to cold press cotton paper. I also got a good variety of brushes here. I will link them down below. The reference photo I'm using today, they are from Map Crunch. So after I gather my reference photos, I put them in Pure Ref. It's like a full screen mood board. I also like to put in some artworks from my favorite artists so I can kind of channel their energy and have a general direction. I also want to talk about color observation for a minute. When you see a color, whether it's from real life or from a photo, it can be hard to pinpoint what exactly that color is. One way to do it is to get really familiar with the color wheel. Also knowing where the colors on your palettes are located on the color wheel. That way you can kind of connect what you see with your eyes to the colors on your palette. If that feels too abstract, another way is to compare your swatches directly with what you're trying to paint and make a judgment from there. I also keep the sky color swatch card on my window so I can directly compare the colors of the sky to the colors I have. Here I made a little chart in the shape of a color wheel. I started with the 12 colors from this little palette. There is no orange or purple here, so I'm mixing their closest neighbors to see what colors I can get. It was able to produce a decent orange and purple, however, compared to colors from the tube, it does feel a little bit watered down. When it comes to purple, ultramarine and quinacridone rose can make some really beautiful purples, almost as good as smalt or ultramarine pink. It wouldn't be as intense as dioxazine purple, but that's a very rare color for landscape. The situation for green is a little bit better, consider that we have lemon yellow and phthalo green, and also a convenient sap green. But still, I won't be able to mix a permanent green light. This is also a very intense color. Now that is covered, let's go through some colors that I like to use for basic landscape elements. We're going to start with the sky. Ultramarine is a great starting point. It is a very purple-leaning and very saturated blue. It can be used for the sky as it is. It can be pushed to be even more violet by adding a bit of cool red to it. Another popular color for the sky is cerulean. It is slightly leaning towards green or turquoise. I personally don't use this color because I try to stay away from cobalt chromium, and I prefer manganese blue hue anyway. But still, it's a really pretty color. It can be pushed further towards turquoise by adding a little bit of phthalo green to it. And if you mix ultramarine and cerulean blue, you'll get a very middle-of-the-road primary blue. So these are the options I like to choose from when it comes to sunny days. Payne's Gray is also a very popular color. It's a perfect color for very moody and stormy skies. You can control how gray this color is by adding more blue or green to it, or you can neutralize it even more by adding a warmer color like burnt sienna to get a very desaturated gray. Sometimes I also add a little bit white into my blues, because blue is a color that can get dark very quick. Adding some white will keep the value on the lighter side. I feel like living in Sweden, I'm no stranger to colorless skies, but I think that's also how I learned to appreciate the difference. And I want that contrast to be reflected in my art. So that's why I don't mind using white to make my paintings look a bit opaque sometimes. And I also find that adding white helps to prevent the paint from spreading uncontrollably on wet paper. It's a really useful way to increase the amount of pigment on your brush without actually darkening the value. Remember in the last video we talked about in daylight hours, the sky is almost never super dark unless you're painting stormy clouds. By the way, it seems that some people consider greenish blue to be warmer than purple-leaning blue, and others think it's the other way around. I'm not sure if there is an correct answer, since both green and purple are on the path of blue traveling towards yellow or red, the colors of flame. So instead of saying cool or warm blue in the future, I'm just gonna say green or purple-leaning blue instead. I hope that makes sense. Here I'm comparing cerulean blue with manganese blue hue. Both are from M. Graham. I think manganese blue hue is just a little bit more vibrant and transparent. It always reminds me of the sky color in storybooks. If you like to use lifting techniques for clouds, try out some different paints to see how they lift. Some paints is a lot harder to lift than others. I guess it also depends on the paper you're using. So it's quite important to try out the techniques and paper you tend to use. Moving on to color green for foliage. The color green is kind of a difficult color to mix for beginners. In nature, there are so many different shades of green. On the color wheel, green can travel towards a few directions but still read as green. Today I'm using sap green as a starting point, and I'm going to mix it towards 4 directions: yellow, orange, blue, and purple. I really recommend you to take some time and enjoy this exercise and find out about your preference. And while you mix these colors, try to imagine in what scenario would these colors make sense. There is a website that I use to find inspiration for foliage. I will link it down below if you're interested. In the past year, I noticed that a lot of urban sketchers from Taiwan and Japan, they include very bright neon greens on their palette. And I'm not surprised after looking at their landscape on MapCrunch. Recently, I also added this neon green color to my palette. I was under the influence of Benjamin Björklund and Chris Hahn's portrait work. So I didn't intend to paint landscape with this color, and I'm still learning how to use it. On the opposite side, mixing orange into greens give me a lot of brownish, mossy greens that kind of reminds me of decay and damp forest. I'm not gonna say these are bad or muddy colors because they can be very useful, depends on the subject matter. And if I feel like it's getting a little bit too dull, like it's turning into brown, I can always add a little bit phthalo green to put it back. I almost forgot to mention, master studies will help you to discover new mixtures or find out the limitation of your palette. I discovered that I really like buttery pastel greens mixed by Naples yellow. And I don't really care for granulation, and that can be totally different for you. Adding blue to a green can also be tricky because it can look very unnatural if it's too saturated. Phthalo green itself is a very blue-leaning green, and it's almost as vibrant as a green traffic light. It would be way too garish if I use that directly on foliage. If I use ultramarine or cerulean, it creates these greens that remind me of luscious summer trees or grass field. And since Payne's gray has black and blue in it, mixing it into greens will create these beautiful pine tree colors that remind me of peridine green. When it comes to purple, since both purple and orange have some red in them, they both go into desaturated greens. But because they are located on different parts of the color wheel, the effects are very different. When you mix purple or violet into greens, it creates these very metallic and airy type of color. I really like using a blue-violet color to mix greens, colors like smalt or indanthrone blue. It gives a sense of distance. Think of distant forest or hills on a cloudy day. Moving on to the colors of the actual land or soil, depends on the landscape. It can range from very light and saturated greens to very deep, dark, rich, almost black colors. And everything in between is possible too. Sometimes it can also be a very creamy, pale hay color. It depends on a lot of things, and it's really wonderful to see how colorful landscapes can be. For me, I heavily rely on convenient ready-made colors. On my regular palette, I have colors ranging from gold yellow, which is the color similar to raw sienna, to quinacridone rust, Van Dyke brown, to raw umber and transparent brown oxide. The reason I like to have so many earth tones is because I often need them in a very thick consistency. It takes a lot of effort and paint to mix a very buttery brown, because I have to add water for the colors to mix, but the water is also diluting the paints. So that's one of the reasons I don't like small palettes without a good range of browns. So here I'm just mixing several earthy colors with some greens on the paper and let them melt into each other. It's usually just indication of the land mass, especially on the first layer. I don't really have any rules or tricks here, because nature can be quite unpredictable depending on the geography and the seasons and daylight, and also what people choose to grow on their farm. So I kind of just paint whatever I see. It kind of feels like recording the nature, and I personally find a lot of joy in doing that. And also, don't be afraid of using muddy colors, especially if you want to paint in a somewhat realistic way, because we are painting soil after all. As long as there is some color shift or value changes in the section, it's still going to be very interesting to look at. I never use just one single color for the entire landmass. I feel like that could make the whole painting look very flat. And also, since it's quite close to us, I can add more textures here, like using a fan brush or adding some splatters to indicate the little rocks or dirts, or maybe some blooms here and there. Oh, and by the way, you might notice that I didn't talk about any colors for the sunset or any autumn trees, all the red, orange, and pinks. I'm skipping that for now. I feel like it can be a bit overwhelming to squeeze everything in one video, but I'd love to cover that in the future. I know I just said that I don't really care for granulation all that much, but I still try to incorporate some granulation for the texture in the foreground, or at least something to indicate the rough or gritty texture, just to make it more interesting to look at. Very often, the clouds in the sky, they get to have the softer transitions, and I want to have something in the picture to contrast that. But yeah, I often have to try to stop myself from overdoing it, because it's very easy to have way too much fun and make it look overworked. The fan brush is a really great unpredictable tool to loosen up the painting. It will mess up the palette a little bit though, dipping it into the half pans, but that's just the nature of painting, and I try not to fuss too much about that. It also helps to keep the pans filled so I don't have to dig into them. And it's the same thing with the liner brush. It's really painful to push the liner brush into half-empty pans to dig for paint. Sometimes I have to use a more appropriate brush to mix the colors first, and then use the liner brush to apply the paint. But yeah, keeping the paints well stocked is very helpful. Okay, we're finally getting to the painting part. I have to speed up the footage because this video is getting way too long. For the first 3 paintings on the left, I'm just going to use the small palette. I want to show you what they're capable of and also how I mix colors. Since our goal today is to explore colors, I'm not going to bother too much with the drawing. I'm also fairly new to this paper. It's a little bit less textured than regular cold press paper, and it's a bit prone to cauliflowers. It is a bit cheaper though, so it's perfectly fine as practice paper, but I still prefer my Saunders Waterford. Anyway, I am painting the first 3 paintings simultaneously. Like, I'll start the second painting while I wait for the first layer of the first painting to dry. You don't have to do this, of course. Actually, I don't recommend doing this. It was a little bit stressful switching between different references. I was running out of daylight, so I was rushing a bit. I also have the tendency to use leftover colors on my palette to mix something else. For example, I very often use the color of the sky, the leftover of that color, to mix into the greens. It's a very easy way to make sure that every color in this picture look like they belong to the same world. So painting 2 or 3 pictures at the same time kind of disrupt that. Normally, I would put on a video from some other art channel about watercolor or pigment and just really take my time to enjoy the process and get the most use out of each reference photo. And if I have very little time, I would just paint a really tiny one, like a thumbnail size color sketch. It usually just takes 5 to 10 minutes. Now I will leave you to watch this process, and I will come back when I'm painting the next 3 reference with my bigger palette. I was quite happy about how the first 3 paintings turned out, but to be honest, I'm really happy to be back with my most familiar paints. Over time, I have discovered some very interesting color mixes, like mixing Jump Brilliant Dark with Potter's Pink. It feels a bit unusual to mix opaque colors with granulating colors, but together with the blue color, they create a very soft gray, and I think it's really pretty for the clouds, especially when it's painted wet on wet. You probably know that I am a huge fan of using opaque watercolors. I feel like this character is slowly merging into my style, even though I don't quite know what my style is just yet. But I'm very happy that one of my favorite artists, he also uses a lot of opaque watercolor. I'm not quite sure if he uses any opaque earthy colors like terra rosa or traditional yellow ochre. I still haven't quite figured out why I don't like opaque browns. It might have something to do with that I use opaque colors to prevent the value from getting too dark, and I do want my browns to be able to get very dark. Now I think about it, maybe I should incorporate some gouache together with watercolor, since I use this medium opaquely anyway. Maybe that could be a way for me to finally enjoy using gouache. But I do enjoy using both transparent paint and opaque paints. I like to have both options so I can mix and match depends on what I need. I also like to paint so many other subject matters like portraits, still life, animals. I also really want to get good at painting florals and figurative work like anatomy studies. So I try not to feel guilty about having such a massive palette, because more than often I do feel the need, especially when the air is very dry and my paper dries really fast. I need to have a lot of convenient colors ready to be used. I'm also very aware of the components of my convenient colors. For example, Amgram sap green can be mixed with phthalo green blue shade and yellow, Indian yellow, and I have both these 2 colors on the palette. So this green is not a color that can expand the color gamut. I guess that's also the reason why I prefer paints that can play well with other colors. Sometimes I even mix 3 or 4 colors together, pushing and pulling the color between different temperatures. So I really prefer the kind of paints that don't do anything too funky or unexpected. In my experience, I find that many granulating duotone colors don't really pull their weight. I need the colors on my palette to cover at least 2 types of subject matters. Take quinacridone red for instance. I can use this color for florals and also for mixing skin tones. Colors like phthalo green, I can use it for turquoise sky or water or people's t-shirt. Also great for mixing foliage. In comparison, the super granulating or Primatech colors, they just don't do that much for me. And they can also be very expensive or difficult to reactivate. But with that being said, I actually really enjoy watching other people using them. I do get the appeal. It's just over time I understood that some products can work fantastically for someone else, but it doesn't always mean it's going to be pleasant for me. 3 years ago, I bought quite a lot of Daniel Smith paints, and I almost don't use them at all. I'm really ready to say goodbye to them. It would be very sad for them to just dry into stones in their tubes. I have given away a few tubes of paints, and I'm very happy that some other artists could have better use of them. This last painting turned out to be my least favorite. The sky was severely overworked. At some point I dropped a very big water droplet on the paper, but somehow, maybe because of the angle, I didn't see it right away, so it created a very big cauliflower. I tried my best to fix it, but the sky still ended up looking very patchy. So I tried to lift some parts and repaint it. I'm not even sure if that helped, but still it's just a small color sketch. These mishaps are bound to happen with watercolor because we don't always control where water goes, so it's not a big deal. In the end, I used some Van Dyke brown and some leftover paints on the palette to paint some tiny birds in 2 of the 6 paintings, and then we're done. I hope you enjoyed this video even if it's quite long, but I do want to include some color mixing footage so you understand my process. I hope you find it helpful. Oh, and thank you very much for everyone who took the time to answer my question in my last community post. Your input is very much appreciated. I will see you in the next one very soon. Goodbye.